Most semesters I teach a course on Western religions for Drury University, and the course begins with Zoroastrianism. And from those early Persian influences, we talk about the chain of evolution from Persia to the familiar modern religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. I don't expect my students to actually remember much about the seemingly exotic rituals and beliefs of Zoroastrianism, but there is a core teaching that I hope sticks with them. Zoroastrianism teaches that the good life is lived by having three qualities: right thoughts, right speech, and right actions. I tell my classes that 2,500 years of theological evolution really hasn't added very much to those three injunctions. Like the story of this first century Rabbi Hillel, who taught a Gentile the whole of the Jewish faith, is summed up in that saying that actually appears in one form or another in all the great religions of the world, that what is undesirable to you, don't do to anyone else. I think it's helpful to be able to distill our faith traditions down to very brief proverbs. Buddhism teaches detachment from greed and lust. Islam holds both chastity and charity as core values. Judaism revolves around concepts of justice and mercy. Christianity teaches a radical compassion. But you can almost describe this kind of synopsis as being little more than bumper sticker theology. That's not quite enough. So if you ask yourself the more serious question, what is it about your religion, what is it about your faith that you desperately hope that your children will preserve? What is it that we want to pass along to the next generation? And when you ask yourself that question, you realize that you better come up with a better vehicle to be able to communicate it in a way that's worth preserving. It wasn't long after we started this church that young parents began to ask the question, do you offer classes for children? And when you don't have a denomination or a specific tradition, it's a lot harder to answer that question than you might think. I ordered samples of Sunday school material from the usual suspects: the Unitarian Universalists, the United Church of Christ, the Disciples of Christ, the Presbyterian and Methodist publishing houses, and the Unity Movement. What we specifically wanted was to avoid religious indoctrination that makes someone try to turn out to be a member of one sect or another. And what we found in this literature from what we thought would be kid-friendly denominations was that they were all very specifically designed to indoctrinate. Each one of them wanted to make sure that they were planting the seeds in young minds that they were going to continue to belong to this particular denomination or sect for the rest of their lives. Now, denominations are dying. They have outlived their usefulness, and yet no institution is ever willing to see itself go out of existence without a fight. So each denomination's materials seem to have the underlying purpose of making sure that the children that grow up in those traditions will never leave them. That hasn't worked for 40 years. Sociologists have marked how people move from one faith tradition to another quite readily, and denominational loyalty simply has not existed for 2 generations. But that information has evidently not filtered back to the publishing houses of those denominations. Thankfully, the Center for Progressive Christianity has made a noteworthy attempt in publishing A Joyful Path, which is a series of Sunday school lessons for elementary students that focuses on behaviors rather than beliefs. And unfortunately, almost everything that we've done to try to teach religion is to teach beliefs. What you meet someone of a faith you're not familiar with, and you immediately ask, what do you believe? But we're realizing that the more relevant question is, what do you do? How do you practice your faith? Now, the Joyful Path, I'm aware, is not a perfect piece of curriculum. What it is a step in the right direction as we're trying to figure out what does it mean to teach faith to a new generation? We want to teach ethics without using the motivational carrot of heaven or the threat of hell. We don't want to use fear or guilt. And we don't want people to change their behaviors or to embrace ethical behavior because of the hope of some personal reward. What we want to do is to pass along to the next generation a healthy, fact-based, realistic spirituality that can inspire them to grow into being good people. Though for me, when I say good, that's always tainted by what Leon Bloy meant when he said that anyone who's a Christian who's not a hero is a pig. To be a good person, I have a sense that you have to really passionately want to try to work to make the world a better place. We're not interested in creating Baptists or Episcopalians. We're not even concerned with whether our children choose to be Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, or Buddhist. What we want them to be is good people. We want them to have a healthy spiritual life, whatever that is for them. We could possibly learn a very valuable lesson from the Church of the Reformation era when Catholics were very inspired by reading the stories about the lives of the saints, and Protestants were educated in John Fox's Book of Martyrs. Now, they, of course, in those days promoted the lives of young women who died defending their virginity, or on the Book of Martyrs side, people who died in evangelical zeal trying to convert Catholics to being Protestants. But we should be able to rehearse the lives of the modern examples of what we regard to be prophetic or healthy spirituality. The modern saints who've given their lives as prophets of justice, of tolerance, of mercy, and of peace. Our church is adorned with images of Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi, Dorothy Day, Archbishop Romero, Black Elk, and Cesar Chavez. Our children should know how Sojourner Truth fought to end slavery. Our children should know about how Dietrich Bonhoeffer stood up to the Nazis. They need to know that even in the darkest days of our history, in the midst of African slavery, there were still thinkers like Henry David Thoreau who were able to articulate a vision of how the world could change. In our day, we're way too interested in tearing down leaders, focusing on their clay feet, making ourselves feel better about ourselves. But for all of the well-known faults of someone like Lyndon Johnson, our children should also know how the Voters' Rights Act got passed. They should hear about when Johnson waged war on poverty before it became a war on the poor that we seem to see now. We should tell stories about people like Ralph Nader and Howard Zinn, who stood up to the powerful to speak truth to power. We should make certain that our children know the true stories of modern saints like Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela. And we should tell them the truth, not the whitewashed versions told only after they were long dead. Cities that now have a Martin Luther King highway never invited King to their communities, and when he planned to come, they did everything they could to keep him from coming. He was investigated and threatened by the FBI. He was frequently jailed and beaten and held in contempt by many people who, when they spoke back on him, acted like they were always big supporters and appreciated what he did. But before he became a national holiday and a highway in a bad neighborhood in every major city in America, he was reviled by the majority of Americans. Nelson Mandela was officially considered to be a terrorist by President Ronald Reagan, who resisted sanctions and divestment of apartheid of American companies operating in South Africa. And only a congressional override of President Reagan's veto forwarded the movement to divest from apartheid. Now, nearly a generation since Mandela was released from prison, where he was tortured and forced into hard labor for 27 years, everyone speaks of him as a modern saint, but we must not forget that before he became a saint, he was a threat. And on his way to becoming the person who we now all universally admire, the reason that he got put in prison was because he was helping to organize a militaristic response to apartheid. He was in prison specifically because he was advocating for a violent overthrow of the white government. And he was kept there. He could have left at any time in those 27 years if he had been willing to renounce the use of violence in response to apartheid. But what he said was he was unwilling to give up that fundamental definition of what it means to be a human, that he had a right to defend his person and his rights. He was nearly blind after 27 years on this rock in the ocean, where he literally had to break rocks in temperatures that soared above 110 degrees, but he would not surrender his ability to fight for freedom. You'll not hear in his eulogies today and this week that he was a sharp critic of the racism in America, and he was a critic of our invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, that he was a friend of Fidel Castro in opposition of American foreign policy. But we should tell our children the truth. You don't get to be a popular saint unless you're willing to swim against the current and be someone reviled by the majority of the population. The path to becoming a prophet doesn't start with talking about forgiveness and love. For Mandela, it got to end there. But it started with him being a threat to the established order. Jesus was killed by the Roman Empire because he was a threat to the Roman Empire. King was a threat to American apartheid. That's why he was beaten and jailed. Mandela was a threat to the economic and civil oppression of the black population of South Africa, and that is why we called him a terrorist before we called him a saint. Our generation makes heroes out of rock stars and professional athletes, but we tend to want to tear down spiritual leaders and political reformers. We need to get over that. My New Testament professor at Vanderbilt, Danielle Pott, enjoined us to preach the church to the church, that we should tell our own stories to our children. Our children were born into a world with integrated schools, integrated neighborhoods, and equal opportunity employment. But we weren't born into that world. We had to make the world that way. Our children should know that Mel and Ruth Miller turned their own home into a miniature United Nations, adopting children of every color 50 years ago, when doing so meant losing friends and jobs and personal safety. Our children who have two mommies or two daddies might assume that that's normal, but for many of us, we didn't come into a world where that was acceptable. We had to march in the streets. We had to demand equal rights for families of same-sex unions. And some of us lost jobs and friends and suffered death threats for doing so, because you make a decision to do what is right, even with great personal risk. Sometimes to draw evil out, you have to bait the trap with your own flesh. They should know that members of our church serve and sacrifice for the homeless, for the rural poor of Nicaragua. They should know that in the room where they get refreshments every week, that members lead meetings on weekdays to help alcoholics and addicts to recover their lives. So forgive me, President Kennedy, but we both want to light candles and curse the darkness. Our children should know that we expect great things from them. We want them to be happy and successful. We want their lives to be full of joy and love, but we are not raising them to be happy consumers. We are raising them to become heroes. And for them to be able to do that, we have to be their examples. Amen.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.